I'm Sarah Wyant, the founder and editor of Agri-Pulse Communications. Our topic today is important for anyone trying to bring new and innovative products to market. It's called Farming in an Integrated World. We will hear from our distinguished speakers with facilitated questions and answers. I'm going to make some brief introductions and encourage you to dig into their full biographies on the website. We also want to hear from you, the attendees. So feel free to offer your questions in the Q&A portion at the bottom of your screen, not the chat box. And if you are experiencing any technical issues, please use the Q&A function to let us know, and our team will assist you. In addition, we will also be recording today's discussion, and the webinar will be available at agripulse.com later today. To start off, I'd like to thank the sponsor of this webinar, the Crop Protection Action Coalition for Trade, or CPAC. It's a coalition of U.S. farmer organizations and partners committed to truth and transparency about American farming practices. Their mission is to increase food security by encouraging global alignment around crop protection policies. To learn more about CPAC, we invite you to visit their website, which is cropprotectionact.org. Now I'd like to invite and introduce our first speaker, Sabina Newman. She's a senior trade advisor at USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service. Prior to her USDA role, she spent 6 years at the U.S. International Trade Commission, where she was project leader of the much acclaimed report, Global Economic Impact of Missing and Low Pesticide Maximum Residue Levels, or MRLs. She brings years of experience providing economic and market analysis on international trade issues to a wide variety of industries. Newman has extensive experience in a range of international trade matters, including trade policy, regulations, market access, trade remedies, customs, and market research. She has advised clients in trade remedy proceedings in the United States, Europe, Asia, and Latin America. It's my pleasure to welcome Sabina. The stage is yours.
Good afternoon. My name is Sabina Newman, and I am the Senior Trade Advisor in the Plant Division of the U.S. Foreign Agricultural Service, where I work to resolve trade issues affecting U.S. exports of crops and crop products. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon, speaking about how pesticide maximum residue levels, or MRLs, affect the ability of farmers to sustainably grow and export crops. Today, I'll address some of the impacts of MRLs that highlight the importance of using risk-based evaluations and science-based standards in MRL decision-making. Governments around the world set MRLs to ensure that agricultural products are safe to consume. These MRLs should be grounded in science and based on completed risk assessments. However, diverging regulatory approaches in some markets are fragmenting the global MRL landscape, creating significant challenges to agricultural production, productivity, and trade, with cascading impacts on food security. It's widely accepted that our global agricultural systems are under pressure to meet demands for food and feed for a global population expected to increase to 8.6 billion by 2030. Sustainably increasing agricultural productivity is essential to food security, but instead, multiple factors are increasingly disrupting food systems and exacerbating food insecurity. Among those are shifting climate patterns, which have changed pest and disease pressures around the world, while at the same time farmers are facing new pressures from invasive species. Pesticides are a critical component of integrated pest management systems, and the judicious use of legally registered pesticides allow farmers to safely meet the growing demand for food. At the same time, open markets improve access to diverse foods and facilitate the movement of foods from areas of surplus to deficit. Trade is a critical tool for enhancing food security, as diversified supply chains allow for quicker adaptation when market disruptions occur. Pesticide MRLs are meant to be trade facilitative, and by that I mean they should enable government officials and competent authorities to ensure that pesticides were applied properly and in accordance with the label. However, oftentimes missing or low MRLs can limit crop protection options with consequential effects on production and trade. Farmers are increasingly forced to adjust their agronomic practices in response to pesticide policies and pesticide MRLs. The lowest export market MRL often becomes the target that growers must meet, regardless of their own domestic MRLs or what unique local pest and disease pressures warrant. And when MRLs vary across markets, farmers face difficult and often costly choices. Some may be able to segregate crops, but for bulked and blended products, for example, like grains, segregation may not be feasible. In that case, farmers have to change pesticides that they use or change their use patterns. However, this assumes that alternative pesticides or alternative production practices are immediately available, equally effective, and affordable. And while the United States is a leader in promoting innovative solutions, the fact is that developing alternative products or processes is a time and capital-intensive process. And so when we see a dwindling number of pesticides that can be used in rotation with one another, we also realize that there's a risk of increased pesticide resistance. And as close substitutes for one another are lost, crop protection becomes even more difficult and is especially challenging for specialty crop producers who have fewer existing MRLs. In addition, compliance with export market MRLs translates into costly pre-export testing and global monitoring, and non-compliance is a serious concern, resulting in extra logistical and transportation fees, the diversion of shipments, sometimes the destruction of shipments, of course, resulting in food waste, and lasting reputational impacts. The growing divergence in MRL policies highlights the importance also of import tolerances so that trade can continue to flow between markets. Some countries have established transparent processes for requesting import tolerances, while others have not. And that's important because import tolerances don't require domestic registration of pesticides. The current landscape also underscores the importance of voluntary codex standards that rely on globally accepted scientific practices, and codex MRLs exist to protect consumer health and facilitate trade. In conclusion, we need to support agricultural policies that are farmer-focused and trade facilitative and ensure we build resilient agricultural systems with robust crop protection options that empower farmers and food systems to handle shocks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sabina. And certainly we've heard a lot about food security, and even more so as we've looked at some of the disruptions all around the globe. Next up, we're going to hear a farmer's perspective and learn a little bit more about what this means on the ground. You're going to hear recorded comments from Jason Sandahl, who's a cherry, pear, and apple farmer from Oregon.
Hi, I'm Jason Sandahl. I'm a cherry farmer in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. It's pretty cold here now, and the trees are resting, as you can see. But what's also resting in the cracks in the bark and in the soils are the insects and fungus that I'll be battling in the spring. Growing cherries is very hard, but selling the cherries is pretty hard too. Cherries have to be harvested, packed, and sold within a matter of days. And this is when the cherries are full of their sugars, their skins become very delicate, and they are most susceptible to molds and insects. In almost every season, there comes a time when I need to make a pretty big decision. Do I do everything I can to protect my crop, or do I need to worry about losing a lucrative export market? I think most farmers would say the same thing. I'm going to always protect my crop. I only have certain crop protection sprays I can use to battle my biggest enemies, which are brown rot and fruit flies. Even though I'm following the pesticide laws in the United States, how much to spray, when I can spray, sometimes other countries don't allow any detection of these spray residues, or they sometimes only allow such a small amount that I wouldn't be able to use these chemicals at all. But if I don't use them according to the label and instructions, like if I were to try to lower the rate or to try to stretch out the timing of the sprays to try to reduce the residues, they wouldn't work right, and my cherries would be covered in mold and full of fruit fly maggots, which would ruin my entire crop. What I mean. At harvest, I take a sample of my cherries to a pesticide lab to see what chemicals may still be on the fruit. And here's an example of one of these reports. What it shows is that for one of the most important fungicides to control brown rot, called triflumazole, it shows that I'm using it properly and complying with U.S. residue standards. The same for fenpropitherin to control the fruit fly. I'm also using this one like I should, and the remaining trace levels of chemicals are normal and expected. It also shows that I can export the cherries to many countries around the world as I comply with their country standards, as well as Codex, which is the international standard. But it also shows I can't sell my cherries in Europe because their standards are so low for both of these chemicals. If I were to try to meet the European standards, I would need to significantly change the way I try to protect my crops, which would result in moldy and fly-infested fruit. So in the end, I still know I made the right decision. My first priority is always to protect my very valuable crop any way I can, even if it means losing an export opportunity.
Well, thank you, Jason, for that boots on the ground perspective. Next, I'd like to bring Paula de Vera into our discussion. She's a senior policy advisor at Copa-Cogeca, representing farmers and agri-cooperatives across the European Union on all topics related to plant health and plant protection, animal health and welfare, as well as risk management and insurance. So she's a busy lady. She also acts as Deputy Director of the General Affairs team in the Secretariat. She graduated in veterinary medicine in 2014 from the Complutense University of Madrid and holds a master's degree in animal production and health from the Complutense and Polytechnic Universities of Madrid. Paula, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good evening, let's say, from Brussels to everyone. Here is like 7:12 p.m. But yeah, I mean, I'm really happy to be here with all of you. And as my predecessors did, I will make a very brief presentation. Well, you can see the first slide. This is usually our Copa-Cogeca template, so just for you to know. So I will go, I think, to the next slide because the introduction of myself was already done. So I will focus on some basic concepts, let's say, from the EU perspective, and probably after this in the question and answer session, we can develop a little bit more. So first of all, from big to small, let's say, let's talk about what the Green Deal means for the European farmers. As you know, well, the European Green Deal was a text published in December 2018, before everything that recently happened, COVID crisis, invasion of Ukraine, etc., etc. So as I was discussing previously with some of the other panelists, first of all, we want to say that the Commission's communication on the European Green Deal approach for us has several axes that, of course, are very much linked to the agricultural sector. And as you can see there, one of the main focus that we have now is the farm to fork strategy. And we feel that, of course, this approach can be an opportunity, but at the same time is a challenge and raises various concerns. So we consider that these aspects must be carefully analyzed, considered, and balanced, put together, because we feel that we are key to managing the transition that the Green Deal proposes. We per se, as we were discussing earlier, we are not, it's true in our position, we are not per se against the farm to fork strategy. We feel that maybe back then the objectives were okay, or more or less okay, or maybe it will be somehow reachable. Right now, we are not so sure anymore. I think we think some means should be put in place, but yeah, as I mentioned, maybe we can develop this later during the discussion. In any case, our feeling is that, yeah, some of these objectives, of course, can strengthen our efforts to tackle climate change, protect the environment, and preserve biodiversity. But we feel that the policy formulation should first and foremost support our work, our economic sustainability, or more to say, the three pillars of sustainability: environmental, social, and economic, and improve the functioning of the markets while contributing to a more sustainable agri-food sector. So let's go to the next slide, please. So what are our views then on the farm to fork? As I mentioned, we don't oppose per se the objectives of the Farm to Fork. We feel that some of them, with enough time and means, could be maybe reachable and could be carefully considered, could be even beneficial for our production, can make us more competitive, can encourage innovation, can encourage as well that, the farmers can want to go farther in order to apply certain standards, which are already very high, but maybe, but there's always room of improvement. But in any case, one of the worrying things that we saw from the beginning in the Farm to Fork, especially since 2020, 2021, when several studies were published, is that they force, including the USDA actually, that they foresaw some reduction of the EU competitiveness and the farmers' income. In this regard, all assessments that we have seen on the Farm to Fork show also a greater dependency on imports from third countries, because our production would be reduced, of course, but at the same time, a clear food and sustainability risk for developing countries, because if we lose the production, that should come from other countries, and maybe it's not only from the developed ones, but also from some underdeveloped that need to, let's say, compensate and move faster than they can to get into a production system that can be actually feasible or workable. And last but not least, all these studies, of course, did not address the cumulative and wide impact of the COVID pandemic and the invasion of the war in Ukraine, which rocketed all the prices for energy, inputs, the cost of, a lot of, cost of inputs basically for farmers. So this worsened the situation, which is even worse. Next slide and last slide, please. So what do we think that should need to change in the future? First of all, we feel that the work that the Commission is doing is in silos. So it's completely independent one from another, which is not the right approach, because they need a holistic view on what will be the full impact of all the policies that they are proposing. Of course, backed by an impact assessment, which, let's say, this full impact assessment on the Farm to Fork and the Green Deal, which has not been yet done per se. Okay. Then from our perspective, the keywords for the future should be, especially for crop protection, which, I think is the main topic today, should be adaptation to farm realities, research, training, and precision farming. For that, we always encourage the institutions to help us and put the means in place. It's not always easy, as well. They try to use some public funds, but it's not always enough, at least of considering the ambition that they have. So it's quite difficult. Innovation must be encouraged, and it is essential to adopt coherent policies, internal and external, to tackle the issue of competitiveness. And we feel that raising the standards for producers in the EU while simultaneously, let's say, increasing imports is not really the right approach. And I think that's pretty much the summary of my intervention. As I mentioned, afterwards, we may discuss in the question and answer, but thank you very much. I think the last slide is the thank you one. So thank you very much, and looking forward to answer to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paula. And I do see some questions are coming in, so that's great. Next up, we're going to hear another boots on the ground perspective, from this time from a farmer in Sweden. I'd like to welcome a recorded remarks from Polly Bergström, a Swedish farmer who's president of the Federation of Swedish Farmers, and sharing his insights on the impacts of this situation.
My name is Polly Bergström. I'm a farmer in the southwestern parts of Sweden, and I'm the president of the Swedish Farmers Federation and also vice president of Copa, which is the joint farming lobby organization in Brussels. At the moment, we have a very intense sustainability discussion around food and agriculture in Europe, and we see from the European Commission side an approach where they look at farmers as a problem and agriculture as a sector that should be restricted and controlled. From the farmer side, we are very much convinced that farmers are a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. We need to improve our sustainability with science-based methods and not restrictions and reduction of production. You probably know that the farm to fork strategies are targeting a reduce of plant production products with 50%, a reducing of use of fertilizer and antibiotics, an increase of organic farming, and also taking 10% of the European land out of production for sustainability or for biodiversity measures. All the impact assessments who has been conducted by USDA and some European universities shows that the farm to fork measures will reduce production in Europe with 10 to 20% and increase prices with 20 to 40%. And we also see some dramatic impacts on the agriculture market from Russia's war in Ukraine, leading to extremely higher energy prices, higher fertilizer prices, and an impact on agriculture markets. We do believe that putting the farm to fork strategy measures on top of the disruption that we already seen on the agriculture markets would be extremely dangerous. The European Commission, they act like food security and affordable prices can be taken for granted. As farmers, we know that food security can never be taken for granted. We have to guarantee that every day, every year. I hope you will have a fruitful conference.
Well, thank you, Polly, for sharing your thoughts with our audience today. For our next speaker, I'd like to introduce Luis Osorio. He's the Executive Director of Crop Protection Science and Technology Association in Mexico City. He's an attorney with more than 20 years of experience managing business chambers and associations, as well as in institutional and government relationships, lobbying, and corporate communication. Previously, he was the General Director of the National Chamber of Air Transportation. Osorio has a master's degree in business law and has studied political negotiation and lobbying. So welcome, Luis.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thanks to Crop Protection Action Coalition for Trade and Agri-Pulse Communication for this kind of invitation to talk about what is happening with Mexico's crop protection regulatory framework. In the next few minutes, I would like to give a brief description of what Mexico is facing in terms of regulatory changes in crop protection and OGMs too. I would like to start with the legislative route, which is in recent months has been the main fight for the sector in the Congress. I call this an attempt to eliminate pesticides in Mexico, and an ideology attempt, as it's why I call it. Last year, there were endless initiatives that tried to push the ban of pesticides in Mexico, fortunately without success. But it was in September 2022 that a declination for several initiatives was developed, which attempt to reform the health law in Mexico, and initially proposing a phase out of highly hazardous pesticides, but they really, in the end, they go too far. And I say they go too far because establish a total ban of pesticides in the country, which that made it very dangerous, not only for the crop protection industry, but for the entire agro-food chain, and obviously putting Mexico's food security at risk. And I say this because we detected important damage in all these kind of initiative. I would like to share with you a few damages that we detected. First, it's important to highlight that those most affected would be the small and medium-sized farmers, who account for 9 out of the 10 farmers in Mexico and generate half of the national product of the production. That is important to have in mind. Another one is less food production, more inflation. It means that the ban of the highly hazardous pesticides would affect the cost and the yields of 200 products growing in Mexico. By reducing the supply of domestic food would increase, obviously, the inflation, and a minor national production would force to the importation of food from countries where the use of pesticides is permitted, and that is a total contradictory situation with the motivation of all these initiatives. Food safety at risk. Why we say this? Because economic estimates indicate that without pesticides, around $16 billion could be lost and jeopardizing the safety Mexico food. I talk about around 40% of the domestic production. It could be in risk with all the crop protection production. And for finally, useless alternatives, I could say that the proposed agroecological alternatives are effective, but we have in mind that only in certain cases and always in a small scale. There are pests so aggressive that they can kill a crop in a day, and that's important to have in mind. Well, I don't want to extend more in these examples. I want only say that the risk of a reform of these characteristics would be catastrophic in economic terms for health and especially for the food security of our country. Advancing in a prohibited regulation is a wrong approach. Reforming for fear and ignorance is the worst path of for a smart regulation. And maybe ignorance, it could be sound very hard, but we can say that knowledge is her partner in this situation. I could say that the crop protection industry is a highly regulated sector. This meaning that we are not afraid to go to a regulatory reform. However, it's very important that this reform is supported by science and not by ideology. With this, I have to let clear that all these attempts to reform in order to ban all the pesticides, it puts in danger not only the economy of a country, but the security of his population, and that's a thing that we have to have in mind. I think I take more minutes that I have for this presentation. I only want to thank again to our moderator and say that I would glad to answer any question of the audience. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Luis. And yeah, I really appreciate your comments. And I'd also like to bring Paula and Sabina back into the fold here so that we can have time for some Q&A before we have our next speaker. And Sabina, I'd like to start with you so that we could talk just a little bit about what are some of the major technical or policy issues that you see as the greatest obstacles to harmonizing MRLs across the globe.
Okay, that's a great question. So MRL harmonization is a challenging issue. For example, I mentioned Codex, which is one of the most widely recognized international efforts to harmonize MRLs. And the US is a strong supporter and contributor to Codex. Codex MRLs are particularly important to developing countries with a limited capacity to set MRLs. But unfortunately, there are some technical constraints at Codex in terms of the length of time it takes to go through a Codex approval process and create a Codex MRL. And that limits the number of MRLs that are generally available for use. So for purposes of comparison, I think Codex has about 4,800 MRLs available compared to, for example, the United States, where I believe we have over 50,000 tolerances. So that technical kind of capacity constraint is difficult. And then, of course, as there are limits on the number of Codex MRLs and countries increasingly establish their own national lists of MRLs, how they do that and the regulatory pathways and processes that they use to establish MRLs can also multiply the number of MRLs and create some disharmony in the global landscape.
So if a company decides to innovate and create this exciting new product, not only do they have to go through the US regulatory system and get approvals that may take 5 to 7 years, but then through Codex with the MRLs, maybe additional timeline on that. Is that how I understand?
Yes, so registrants can pursue MRLs either by trying to register a pesticide within a country and get an MRL, or a Codex member can support a MRL for a specific pesticide. But in any event, there are a lot of data trials and toxicity information that registrants are responsible for providing for those purposes. So the more pathways you have to get different MRLs in different countries, you increase the burden and the complication for complying with those MRLs.
Sounds like a lot of time and cost. Paula, a question came in from the audience, and just wanting you to elaborate a little bit on whether you believe the farmer voices are being really heard by decision makers when it comes to farm to fork.
Opening my microphone. Thank you very much for the question. I think it's one of the $1 million questions that we actually have now on the table on our plates in the EU, particularly in our daily work to represent farmers and cooperatives. So, I mean, if I would be blunt, I would say that not much, to be honest. I mean, we feel that we have said a lot in the past 3-4 years, almost 5, counting from election to election, on how this should be done or what should be taken into account, particularly from a practical point of view on what actually happens at farm level. But as you may have seen, most probably in the past months, particularly the second half of 2022, the debate escalated to the point that actually we were accused to be scaremongers. One of our presidents, the presidents of Copa, actually you saw the video from Palle Borgström. He's the vice president of Copa, the side that represents farmers. So let's say the president of Copa, Mrs. Christian Lambert from France, from FNSEA, she was directly accused by Vice President Timmermans of the Commission of scaremongering and saying things that were not really true. Actually, what we were saying is that, food security cannot be taken for granted, and that we should be careful on how to apply this kind of measures. So that was quite a backlash for us, because we felt a little bit, not understood from the, let's say, from the side, to be really honest, that actually produces the food and the products and do their best to produce every day the high quality and nutritious food, and also high quality non-food products, but that are also quite used by the society. And we don't feel that even the Commission is taking into account what has been already done in the past, in terms, for instance, of innovation at farm level. That has not been taken into account. So that's really sad, because that could be a good evidence to base future proposals. But I don't know. I mean, it's been quite discouraging in that regard.
Thank you for your perspective. Louise, tell us a little bit more about how ProSeed interacts with the various bodies of the Mexican government, and where you can weigh in and focus on agricultural policy development that is science-based.
Okay, ProSeed, as a leading association representing the crop protection science industry in Mexico, obviously we are very closely work with all very authorities, our regulatory authorities here in Mexico. We work with the Ministry of Agriculture, to Health Ministry, and many regulators here in the country. The important here is, as in this case, as I said before in the Congress, we have to recognize that we have an open space dialogue with these senators and make more sensitive to understand our situation and the repercussion that reforms and changes to our regulatory framework it could have in Mexico. I think that we have a huge opportunity to provide more information and be more closer with all these kind of regulators in order that make that their decisions understood that impact that is not only here in Mexico but in many regions in that we are related as North America. It's one, but South America and many other regions. And I think that the recent experience that we have in the Senate give us the opportunity to understand that we could develop a work closely with many senators, not only with the opposition ones. I have to say that the official party do. And that's a good sign, because I think that exists the space to have this kind of dialogue with them and develop the better way to structure and develop a smart regulation. That's that I can say about it.
Thank you. We do have a lot of questions coming in. One was pretty basic about what is MRL stand for. And in case you missed at the beginning, maximum residue levels is what we're talking about. And I'm sorry if we didn't make that any clearer, because in Washington, we can all be guilty of acronyms overuse. But another question, actually several from Sharon, and I'm going to direct this to you, Sabina. What are some of the specific export markets the U.S. has lost due to the lack of import MRL or just pesticide bans? Can you give us any examples?
Sure. I think there's a variety of challenges in terms of where MRLs impact trade, and maybe it's instructive to think about the relative importance of the EU as a large agricultural trader and consumer, and especially because the EU itself has characterized their regulatory process as among the most strict in the world. There are some unique factors that the EU incorporates into their regulatory processes that make compliance with MRLs difficult, and that often has to do with pesticide registration evaluations and how the EU captures hazard-based cutoff criteria into those, as well as kind of trickle-down effects then on MRLs. And some of this kind of also plays into just timelines based on the fact that the EU is in the middle of a renewal process and reapproval process where they're looking at and revisiting pesticides and MRLs. And so oftentimes we understand that especially when an active substance is not approved for renewal or faces some restricted renewal decisions and conditions, then that has impacts on MRLs such that they're either reduced or withdrawn. And I think kind of touching back on some of the import tolerance problems that I had referenced earlier, import tolerances are meant to help kind of bridge areas where a pesticide can be used domestically and maybe it's not allowed for use in the EU. And we understand that there is increasing concern and uncertainty within our domestic stakeholders and agricultural producers also around the world in many markets, in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, where there's concern that once a substance isn't renewed in the European Union, that import tolerances face a very uncertain pathway forward. And that, of course, would affect trade flows.
Right. And just to build on that, question for you, Paula, the Commission has stated, and some EU farm groups have supported applying farm to fork criteria on other countries' exports. even though there's a lot of different climatic factors and other concerns about how products are produced and grown. Do you see that in the future? Is that correct, that the farm to fork criteria will be applied on other exports? And how would that work?
So I think we have two different things here. First of all, it is true, because we have all heard it, that the EU has tried to, let's call it, impose these kind of standards in other countries. And actually, I remember that there was a meeting, I don't remember, I think it was last year or late 2021 between Mr. Vilsack from the United States, Secretary of Agriculture, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not so into US politics, apologies, but I think he's the Secretary of Agriculture, and Mr. Timmermans. And as far as I recall, Mr. Timmermans suggested that the US, for instance, should follow the example of the EU. And actually, Mr. Vilsack said, thank you very much. We will see what we do. And actually, I think they turned immediately to make a deal with Mexico, because that was even more convenient, which I could perfectly understand. I mean, one thing that we have been insisting on the Commission, not only on pesticides, for instance, but on other topics, is that they cannot just impose a third country. We've perfectly acknowledged that they cannot impose a third country any rule, because each country has its rules, so its legislation, so we cannot step into each other's gardens. But on the other hand, our feeling is that the Commission is trying to find a way to put these standards or these impositions in maybe in the trade policy, or in, for instance, talking about import tolerances, to find a way to, let's say, consider that some products, for instance, will not be imported anymore, or certain, let's say, certain products treated by certain substances that are not accepted in the EU, which this is a topic that we are still discussing inside Copa-Cogeca, considering, yeah, of course, terms of competitiveness, questions of how this will affect maybe the use in Europe of emergency authorizations, because we still need those type of derogations. We don't have alternatives to certain substances that are useful, that were banned. So we still need to ask for these 120 days derogations. So it's a very difficult matter, but I think that at some point we will convince the Commission that this is a no-go. I mean, imposing other countries things to do, it's impossible for them from a legislative, legal point of view. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. I hope so.
Yeah, well, thank you. It sounds like there's a lot of discussion around this topic, and certainly in the US as well. Louise, talking about a lot of questions coming in just about what Mexico is going to be doing with pesticide bans in the future. Obviously, we've been watching this very closely and writing a lot on Agri-Pulse about the dispute between the US and Mexico over GM corn imports and your president's dislike of glyphosate. Can you give us an update of where that stands from your perspective right now, and what, if any, we should expect in the future in terms of any other pesticide bans that may be coming our way?
Well, first of all, I could say that we have a lot of work to do here in Mexico in order to make a front to this kind of push to try to ban all the pesticides, because I think in the legislative or in the Congress they push harder every day for this kind of initiative, that there are more support in ideology that in a technical support, and that's a huge concern for our industry. And we have many other topics like the OGMs that in the recent days you can hear about it with the reunion that we have in Mexico with the Canadian government and the US government too. And I think that in that order, there was a huge step in order to try to solve this kind of situation that have the origin in a decree, in a presidential decree that established the phase out of the glyphosate here in Mexico, with a limited time to 2024, and GMO corn too, and for importation and commercialization here in Mexico, and that's a huge concern for the industry. I think that in these days that our economic secretary, Raquel Buenrostro, present and a proposal to the two governments in order to establish a solving way to attend this problematic. But these are affecting the establishing the USMCA, and that's important to see, because if we lost that perspective, we could jeopardizing so huge numbers of exportation that we have in Mexico, and I think that the commercial balance into the three countries, but it's a difficult to me say how it's gonna end this, because it's a work in progress. But we are optimistic that the proposal that our government are preparing in order to attend the commentaries and all the work that they developed in the last days, it's going to be the right to establish with more clarity not only what kind of crops are affected by this decree, but establish in order to establish a more reasonable limit times, and we are, and I say it again, that we have many work to do here, because we are seeing more and more this attempt to try to establish a prohibited regulation, and as I said before, I think that there was the wrong approach that we could understand in a reform or in a established regulation framework for a country.
Thank you. And just to build on that, I assume farmer associations are getting engaged on this topic. Is that correct? And are they supporting bans, or are they asking for more tools for freedom to operate?
Yes, we work closely in the recent months with all the farmers in order to explain the repercussions and this kind of changes that the regulatory that our authorities try to impose here in Mexico. And I think that the voice of all the farmers here in Mexico was very important. We work closely with many farmers that are part of Proceed, but we have a closely work with another bodies or another organization like the CNA and other that here in Mexico represent the voice of the farmers. That I think that was crucial to stop the attempt that present in the last legislative period, the last year.
Thank you. Paula, a quick question for you as we wrap up our Q&A time. How do decisions get made at Copa-Cogeca when you have so many different countries to represent, and is there a weighted vote in any way? Can you just walk us through how a decision making does occur?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. So yeah, I think because of my 5 minutes time, I didn't have the time to put the slide that explains a little bit what Copa-Cogeca is and how do we usually organize ourselves. So just for you to have a big picture, Copa-Cogeca is a two-in-one organization. So we have two sides, Copa that represents farmer organizations and Cogeca that represents agri-cooperatives. So in round numbers, I would say that in Copa we have 22 million farmers, family members actually from farmers, and then around 22,000 cooperatives under Cogeca. So they are usually organized, and the membership in Copa-Cogeca is represented by national organizations that cover, let's say, horizontally all the topics in agriculture. And then we have several levels of decision-making process. So first we have in the bottom, we have what we call the working parties, which we have 45 working parties divided between, let's say, horizontal topics, the sectorial topics. And there we have experts, and we have elected chairs and vice chairs, one chair and two vice chairs. Those working parties can discuss and take decisions their level on certain topics. Particularly, well, it depends also on the relevance of the topic. The document or the discussion can be raised to the next level, which is the policy coordination, which is composed by members from the national, what we call the national offices here in Brussels. So there are permanent offices of our members in Brussels. So that we have monthly meetings with them for both farmers and cooperatives. If the topic is relevant enough, again, we go to the next level, which is the president's level. So as I mentioned before, we have president of Copa, and then we have president of Cogeca, and we have 5 vice presidents for each. So then we meet twice a month here in Brussels, and we have our presidia meetings. And then we see if, some of the decisions need to pass through the presidia and get the approval of the president. In any case, all of these documents, once approved, irrespective of the level, we may use them to for our lobbying activities towards the Commission, the Parliament, or the Council, mostly. And then we usually circulate them or send them attached to a letter, or we send a letter individually, and then we send the document afterwards, depending on the process, let's say in which stage the document is. So yeah, basically that's in a rough manner, this is our decision level 3 for, then we have, of course, nuances, but that will give for another hour of workshop. So maybe for the next time.
Thank you for the elevator version. We appreciate that.
Yes.
And I would really like to thank all of you for not only your presentations, but for answering these questions. It's been very informative. And now we're going to switch to our next speaker as we aim for our wrap up. And this is a person who's familiar to many of you, our friend Ted McKinney, who's the CEO of the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture. Previously, he served as the first USDA Undersecretary for Trade and Agricultural and Foreign Agricultural Affairs from 2017 to 2021 at USDA. And prior to that, Ted was very active in a lot of agricultural roles, including serving as director of the Indiana State Department of Agriculture. He served many years with Dow AgroSciences, Lanco, where he's director of global corporate affairs. So welcome, Ted, for some wrap-up comments.
Well, thanks, Sarah. Am I coming through okay, I hope? I'll just presume the answer is yes. Well, thanks so much. And I want to thank all the speakers. So many of you, and you made such good points. I can only endorse all of those, from those that use PowerPoints to those that spoke from their heart or their video. Sabina, Paula, Luis, Jason, and Pauli. Really, really appreciate that. And I'll build on some of your thoughts, but my heart goes out to you, and particularly to you, Paula, in Copa-Cogeca, because I think what's being thrust upon your farmers, your members, is one perhaps that may never be able to be rivaled in terms of its potential damage, not just to what you do and your farmers do, but to the world. I'm going to quote first one of my favorite people, who, by the way, is no stranger to Europe himself. Same could be said for Mexico. Our former president, Dwight Eisenhower, said something I think is very, very relevant here, and it's ag focused. He said, you know, farming looks mighty easy when your plow is a pencil and you're 1,000 miles from a cornfield. Now you think about that. Now you could substitute pencil for something else. It might be a computer. It might be 6,000 to 10,000 miles, and it might not be corn. It might be some other crop or critter. But for goodness sakes, the point stands that I think what we have here are a lot of people that need to get out of their office. When I was traveling, in many cases to Europe, I made 4 trips to Europe to one that they made our way. And that's after only after I was coaxing them to come our way. I believe that many of those in the commission and others, that if you want to come to the US or to Canada or to Brazil or to Argentina or to any other country that is using all of its tools so that you can see what the world is like, and that this isn't some ogres in other countries doing harm to the environment. In fact, I would dare say that many of the things that we're doing would be things that you could take lesson from. So my heart goes out to you, Paula, and your members, and we're going to fight with you to push back on this. Let me start with a compliment. I try to look for the best in people, and I like to play well in the sandbox. And I want to start by saying the objectives of the EU Green Deal, branded, I think, as Farm to Fork, are really outstanding. When I first read those many months, now years ago, I said, well done, Europe. Way to step out there. In fact, I said, why don't we do that in the US? Now, I think a lot of that's because we've been trying to follow those practices and those objectives all along. Growing up on our family farms in Indiana, I'll never forget my dad and grandparents all saying, leave that land better than you found it. And you've all heard some version of that. So I admire the objectives and I applaud the EU for its objectives. But please don't cut this next part out and think that I'm simply applauding the entirety of Green Deal and Farm to Fork, because the tactics are, in my view, and the world's view, it's not just me, horribly misguided. First of all, let me point out that all of us around the world, those that farm, those that are in food processing, are always seeking a kindler and gentler agriculture. And oftentimes that means less pesticides or no pesticides, less fertilizer or no, transitions such that you could go to no-till or minimum till. Food security problems are always on the mind. I remember growing up talking in my 4-H and FFA speeches about how proud I am about the productivity and the rise of productivity in my farm and those across the world, because the world and the consumers of the world needs that food. So Paula, another point from your very capable and good PowerPoint presentation. Yes, the studies from your own universities and institutes in Europe are correct when it says productivity will decline. You will rely on more imports. And I'd like to say that if you're imposing those same draconian measures on us, you're basically saying to other countries of the world, the 80% along with you that produce most of the food for the world, stop using technologies. It's bad. And this is going to create great harm to the world's consumers at a time when we have to double, 2x, double food production by 2050. One study that you did not cite that I'll call out for people is one done by the very independent Economic Research Service of USDA. It's a 2019 study. It basically found that, yes, all the things you said are true, except that food security really gets into trouble because many more of the European countries become net food importers. I know that a dozen years or so ago, the UK became a net importer. I've read that somewhere in the next few years, either France or Germany, I can't remember which one, soon to be a net importer. That is not what we as a society, as a global consumer society, can even remotely think about if our goal must be to feed more people. And yes, you're correct, Paula, the Ukraine-Russia issue, that nasty attack by the Russia on the Ukrainians, only exacerbates that. Same with COVID. I'll double down on it. I think it was a bad idea to undertake some of these tactics of Farm to Fork, even if COVID had never happened, and even if Russia had not attacked Ukraine. So I think we should not look to those as the only reasons. They have only sharpened our focus on the importance of this. Let me talk about our farm. Without any regulations, our farm in the last 10 years has steadily reduced its use of pesticides, notably insecticides, and it's steadily reduced its amount of fertilizer. No heavy hand of government did it just because it was a better way to farm. It was kinder in general to the environment. And all of this is because we wanted to do right by our own environment and our own profitability. And I have to believe the same is in Europe. So here are some suggestions, 5 quick ones. First, I want to invite again the European Commission. Yes, all of you, come to the US, or if you don't like us, go to Canada or Brazil or Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, countries where they're using all the tools, and see what we're doing that maybe you can understand why we are objecting to some of these tactics. Secondly, I beg of you, leave Codex alone. It's one of the finest creations of the United Nations ever. It's focused on food safety. And if those of you in Europe want to open that up to animal welfare and sustainability and all these other things, you're going to undermine it and perhaps cause it to crash. It's doing a fine job, and it's bringing products that the world needs, and particularly the developing world. Third, please, I beg you, rethink the precautionary principle. I get the objectives behind it, but I would argue that most other countries of the world, and certainly the farmers, are practicing it already. I've had many people equate that if you applied the precautionary principle as it is to farming and ag in these cases, to a car going down the Autobahn, the highest, fastest speed you could go is 5 kilometers per hour or less. That's the direct equivalent of the imposition that precautionary principle is putting on that. So I'm right with you on the spirit of precautionary principle. That's what we've practiced on our own farm with these reductions I've cited. And by the way, we can prove that. We've got all the records to demonstrate that. So at a time when we've got a double production, rethink those things, because I think alone for you and also for the rest of the world, it's going to be a clear and present danger. And finally, I would beg of you that you follow through on your own DG Agri Secretary General and the call of Copa and Cogeca and so many others. Please rethink the data, the figures, the cause behind why you've applied these tactics. Go back to your objectives and say, can we meet those another way? We will be there to help you every step of the way, and we'll applaud you for it, just as I've applauded your objectives. And the same, I think, could be said to our friends in Mexico, who I think are trying very hard to do the right thing. But the banning of products is only going to cause greater imposition on the poor farmers that President AMLO seeks to help. We've seen and talked to them firsthand. So I'll stop there by saying you are our friends, and you've been our friends for decades in both countries and other countries in the world. But this EU Green Deal, this farm to fork, or at least its tactics, are, I think, one of the greatest threats you're presenting to mankind. Let us work together and find a different solution. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all.
Thank you, Ted, and special thanks to all of our speakers today. If you really want to stay in the know on what's happening with farm, food, and rural policy, please bookmark agri-pulse.com. If you're not a subscriber, you can sign up and get a free month-long trial. If you missed any portion of the webinar today and you'd like to share this conversation with friends, we're going to post a recording of the event on agripulse.com as soon as it's available, hopefully later today. And you'll receive an email when it becomes available online if you have registered for this event. Thanks for all of you who joined us, and have a great rest of your day.